My mother was the most hated woman in our county for 30 years, and I spent my entire life trying to escape her shadow until the day I found the blue ledger hidden inside her floorboards. Growing up, everyone knew Margaret Vance. They called her the Iron Vulture. She was the woman who ran the local debt collection agency with a heart made of dry ice. She didn't care if you were sick. She didn't care if it was Christmas. If you owed the bank, Margaret was at your door with a clipboard and a cold stare. As her only son, I felt the weight of that reputation every single day. Kids at school wouldn't play with me because their parents had been served papers by my mother. I grew up in a house that felt more like a courtroom than a home. Everything was about discipline, accounting, and the cost of living. On my 18th birthday, she didn't give me a cake. She handed me an invoice. It was a detailed list of every cent she had spent on my food, clothing, and shelter since the day I turned 13. She told me I had 10 years to pay it back with 5% interest. I hated her. I packed my bags that night and didn't look back for 15 years. I moved 3 states away, worked 3 jobs, and eventually built a successful career in architecture. I sent her a check every month for the debt, never including a note, never calling to check in. I wanted her to know that I was better than her. I wanted her to see that I didn't need her love, only her receipts. But then, 2 months ago, I got the call. My mother had suffered a massive stroke. She was in a vegetative state, and as her next of kin, I had to deal with the estate. I flew back to my hometown, planning to sell the house, close the business, and bury the memory of Margaret Vance forever. The house was exactly as I remembered it. Cold, sterile, and smelling of lemon wax. But when I went into her office to find the deed to the house, I tripped over a loose floorboard under her desk. When I pried it up, I didn't find stolen money or hidden assets. I found a stack of blue ledgers, dating back to 1994. I opened the first one, expecting to see a record of people she had ruined. Instead, I saw a list of names. My names. Every check I had sent her for 15 years was recorded there, but next to each entry, there was a note. Leo sent $500 today, transferred to account 402B. He sounds tired on the memo line. His handwriting is shakier. I hope he's eating enough. I felt a lump in my throat. She had never cashed the checks. She had been moving the money into a separate account. But that wasn't even the most insane part. Wait until you hear what happened Tuesday. I spent the next 6 hours sitting on that dusty floor, reading through 30 years of my mother's secret life. The ledgers weren't just about me. They were about everyone in town. There were entries for the Miller family, who lost their farm in '98. There were entries for the widow down the street, Mrs. Higgins. According to the public record, my mother had foreclosed on them. But according to these ledgers, my mother had bought their debts personally. She had used her own salary to pay off their interest, then set up fake payment plans that they could actually afford. She wasn't a vulture. She was a filter. She was standing between the ruthless banking systems and the people of this town, taking all the hits and all the hatred so they could keep their homes. I couldn't believe it. I stayed up until the sun rose, tracing the lines of her handwriting. She had meticulously documented every mean thing she had ever done, followed by the secret reason why. She had fired her assistant, Sarah, in 2005. The whole town talked about how cruel it was. The ledger showed that Sarah had been stealing to pay for her daughter's insulin. My mother fired her so Sarah could collect a massive severance package and unemployment, then secretly paid for the insulin through an anonymous foundation for 3 years. I felt like the world was spinning. The woman I had spent a decade and a half loathing was a stranger to me. I thought I knew who she was. I was completely wrong. I decided I needed to see these people. I needed to know if they knew. I went to the local diner, a place where my mother was never welcome. I sat at the counter and waited for the owner, a man named Bill who had supposedly lost his first restaurant because of my mother's aggressive collections. When Bill saw me, his face hardened. He recognized the Vance nose and the Vance eyes. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked over, leaning heavily on the counter. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I was Margaret's son. He spat on the floor. I didn't flinch. I just took out the blue ledger and opened it to a page from 12 years ago. I pushed it across the counter. I told him to read the entry for August 14th. Bill grumbled, reaching for his glasses. He started reading, and I watched his face. His eyes went from angry to confused, then to wide-eyed shock. The ledger detailed how my mother had seized his equipment, only to lease it back to him for $1 a year through a shell company so the bank couldn't touch it. Bill's hand started to shake. He looked up at me, his voice cracking. He asked me if this was a joke. I told him it wasn't. I told him she was in the hospital, and she might never wake up. Bill didn't say a word. He just turned around, walked into the kitchen, and I heard him start to sob. That's when I saw the name on the second envelope. It was a name I hadn't thought about in years. It was my father's name. My father had supposedly died in a car accident when I was 5. That was the story I was told. My mother never spoke of him. There were no photos of him in the house. She had wiped him from existence. But in the ledger, under a section marked "The Cost of Silence," there were monthly payments to a facility in the northern part of the state. The payments were astronomical. They had been going on for 25 years. I realized then that my father wasn't dead. I drove 4 hours to the address listed in the ledger. It was a high-end residential care facility for people with severe traumatic brain injuries. I walked into the lobby, my heart hammering against my ribs. I gave the receptionist my father's name, David Vance. She smiled sadly and told me he was in the garden. I walked out back and saw a man sitting in a wheelchair, staring at a fountain. He looked like an older, hollowed-out version of me. I sat down next to him. He didn't turn. He didn't even blink. I started talking, telling him who I was. There was no flicker of recognition. A nurse came over and told me that David had been there since the accident. She said he required 24-hour specialized care that cost nearly $15,000 a month. I asked her how it was paid for. She told me a woman named Margaret Vance had never missed a payment. Not once. Even during the recession, when the town was falling apart, even when she was working 3 jobs. I realized the debt she had charged me, the vulture persona she had adopted, the hatred she had endured from the entire town. It was all to keep him here. It was to give him the best possible life, even if he didn't know who she was. She had sacrificed her reputation, her relationship with her son, and her own soul to be the villain so she could afford to be his guardian. I looked at my father's hands. They were soft. They were well cared for. My mother's hands, I remembered, were always covered in paper cuts and calluses from counting coins and filing paperwork. She had taken all the friction of the world onto her own skin so he could sit in a garden and feel the sun. You won't believe what the bank teller told me next. I left the facility in a daze. I drove straight to the bank where my mother had worked for 3 decades. I wanted to see her old office. I wanted to see where the Iron Vulture had spent her days. The manager, a cold man named Mr. Sterling, agreed to let me in only because I was handling the estate. He walked me to a small, windowless office in the back of the building. It was barely a closet. He told me that my mother had been the most productive collector in the history of the firm. He said she had a gift for finding money where there was none. I looked at the desk. It was scarred with cigarette burns and coffee stains. Then I asked him about the anonymous donations the bank received to cover bad loans. I had seen hints of it in the ledger. Mr. Sterling's face went pale. He told me that was confidential information. I didn't care. I told him I knew. I told him my mother had been funneling her own commissions back into the accounts of the people she was supposed to be ruining. He scoffed. He said she was a fool. He said she could have been a millionaire, but instead, she lived in a drafty house and drove a 15-year-old car. He called her pathologically selfless. He meant it as an insult. To me, it sounded like a canonization. I walked out of that bank and went back to the hospital. I sat by my mother's bed. She looked so small under the white sheets. Her skin was like parchment. I took her hand, the hand that had signed 1,000 foreclosure notices and 1,000 secret checks. I whispered to her. I told her I found the ledgers. I told her I went to see Dad. I told her I was sorry. I stayed there for 3 days, sleeping in the chair. On the 4th day, a lawyer arrived. He was an old man, nearly 80, with a briefcase that looked older than I was. He told me he was my mother's personal attorney. He had a letter for me, but it was only to be delivered if she was no longer able to speak for herself. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper in her hand changed everything I thought I knew about my father. The letter didn't start with, "I love you," or "I'm sorry." It started with a confession. "Leo," it read, "the accident wasn't an accident. Your father didn't just crash that car. He was trying to protect us." The letter explained that my father had been a whistleblower for a major construction firm that was cutting corners on government contracts. They had tried to buy him off, but he refused. The accident was a hit. The brakes had been tampered with. My mother knew that if she went to the police, the people responsible would come back to finish the job. She knew that if she looked like a victim, they would keep watching her. So she made a deal with the devil. She took a job at the bank, the very bank that funded those construction firms. She became their most ruthless asset. She made herself so useful, so cold, and so hated that she became invisible to the people who were hunting my father. She played the role of the villain to stay close to the money, to watch their books, and to ensure they never suspected she was still taking care of the man they tried to kill. She had spent 25 years behind enemy lines. She had destroyed her own life to build a fortress around ours. I realized then that my mother had been playing a much longer game than I ever imagined. She wasn't just a shield for the town. She was a double agent in a war I didn't even know was happening. The letter continued, explaining that the debt she charged me was her way of making sure I had a massive nest egg that the government or her enemies couldn't touch. "I knew you would hate me," she wrote. "I needed you to hate me. If you loved me, you would have stayed. If you stayed, you would have been a target. Your hatred was your armor. It took you far away from this town and far away from the shadows that follow me. Every check you sent was a heartbeat. I knew as long as the checks came, you were alive, you were working, and you were free." I finished the letter and looked at my mother. Her eyes were still closed, but her breathing had changed. It was shallow. I called the nurse, but I already knew. She was slipping away. I held her hand and told her she could stop now. I told her the war was over. I told her I was safe, and Dad was safe, and the town was safe. But the final discovery in that basement was the one that broke me. After she passed, I went back to the house to finish packing. I went into the basement, a place I was never allowed to go as a child. It was always locked with a heavy padlock. I used the key I found in her jewelry box. I expected to find more ledgers, or maybe evidence against the construction firm. Instead, I found a room full of light. She had installed a sun lamp and filled the basement with hundreds of thriving plants. But they weren't just random plants. They were organized by year. There was a section for every year I was gone. Each plant had a tag with a date and a memory. Leo's first day of college. I hope he finds friends who value him. Leo's first job. I hope he doesn't work as hard as I do. Leo's 30th birthday. I bought a cupcake and ate it here with him in spirit. She hadn't been living in a cold, sterile house. She had been living in a secret garden of her love for me. She had spent every night in this basement, surrounded by the growth she couldn't witness in person. There were photos, too. Photos I didn't know existed. Photos of me at my graduation, taken from a distance. Photos of me walking into my office building. She had been there. She had followed me from the shadows, watching me grow, making sure I was okay, but never stepping into the light because she didn't want to bring the darkness with her. I sat in the middle of that basement garden and cried for the mother I never knew, and the mother who had given everything to make sure I never had to be like her. She was the greatest actress I had ever seen, and her greatest performance was being the villain so I could be the hero of my own life. I realized that love isn't always a warm hug or a kind word. Sometimes love is a cold stare that keeps the world at bay. I spent the next year liquidating the estate, but not the way I planned. I didn't sell the house. I turned it into a community center. I used the money in the account, the money from my own checks and her secret commissions, to create a foundation in her name. But I didn't call it the Margaret Vance Foundation. I called it the Iron Shield. I went back to every person in that ledger. I returned their debts. I told them the truth. The town that had spent 30 years spitting at the mention of her name now holds a candlelight vigil for her every year. Bill, the diner owner, put a plaque on his wall. It just says, "To the woman who took the hit so we didn't have to." My father passed away peacefully 6 months after she did. I think, in some way, he knew she was gone and decided he didn't need to wait anymore. I buried them next to each other. On her headstone, I didn't put "Beloved Mother" or "Rest in Peace." I put the words she wrote at the very end of her letter to me. The books are balanced. I still live in the city, but I come back once a month to tend to the basement garden. It's the only place where I feel like I can truly talk to her. I realize now that we all have a villain in our lives. Someone who makes the hard choices. Someone who says no so we can say yes. Someone who bears the weight of the world's cruelty so we can stay soft. My mother was the iron vulture, the debt collector, the queen of mean. But to me, she was the most successful architect I've ever known. She built a life for me out of nothing but her own sacrifice and a few blue ledgers. She taught me that the most important things in life aren't the things you own, but the things you protect. Status update. I've just finished distributing the last of the funds from the debt account to the local school district. The town is thriving, and the construction firm my father blew the whistle on was finally dismantled after I turned over the evidence my mother had spent decades collecting. I'm sitting in her old office now, looking at the floorboards. I finally feel at peace. But it makes me wonder about the people we judge every day. We see the surface. We see the mean boss, the cold neighbor, or the strict parent. But we never know the war they are fighting behind closed doors. We never know who they are protecting. So, here is my question for you. If you found out that the person you hated most in the world had been secretly sacrificing everything to save you, would you be able to forgive yourself for the years you spent hating them? And more importantly, who in your life might be playing the villain just to keep you safe? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you have a story about a parent who wasn't what they seemed, I'd love to hear it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that the world is much deeper than it looks.